Ashley Franssen-Tingley is the Director of Partnership for the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, and she's on the show today to talk about human trafficking in Canada and the work that's being done to protect people who are being trafficked and hopefully bring a stop to this. And I know, Ashley, that language can be very triggering, so please correct me if I use inappropriate words or language that's triggering. And welcome. Thank you for coming on and talking about this important issue. I'm not sure people know the level of human trafficking that goes on in Canada. Can you give me a definition of human trafficking so we're not all thinking about movies where people are brought over and locked in rooms and transported around? And not that that isn't part of human trafficking, but in general, what is the broader definition?
Sure. So that's a great place to start. Trafficking is when you're using elements of force, fraud, or coercion to compel someone to provide a labor or a service for the benefit or the material gain of somebody else. So in Canada, we typically see domestic trafficking, domestic sex trafficking. That's largely impacting Canadian women and girls. We also have elements of forced labor here. And typically what we see with forced labor is those are foreign nationals coming into Canada, usually legally under our guest worker programs, temporary foreign worker program, international students who are being compelled or forced to work against their will.
And when we talk about, let's just talk about the labor element first. Sure. Sometimes it's somebody's nanny. They'll say, oh, it's my nanny, or I think the proper term is domestic worker, but somebody would say, oh, my nanny or my cleaning lady. And they may or may not know that that person is being trafficked. So how would you identify that that's happening? Because the vast majority of people are not going to go out there and say, hey, I want to hire a human trafficked person to look after my kids.
Sure. And the vast majority of trafficking victims aren't going to put their hands up and say, I'm being trafficked and I need help, really. Trafficking is really subtle. What we're seeing, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, there's an existing relationship there between the trafficker and the person that they're exploiting. But traditionally with labor trafficking situations, we're seeing individuals who are lacking kind of freedom of movement. They might not have access to their identity documents, their passport, their work permit. They might not be able to use their cell phone. They might not have access to their own money. Again, they're being controlled, they're being monitored. They may be facing extremely long hours, so they're not able to get the proper breaks that they're afforded by the law. They may be working 7 days a week. And then oftentimes we're finding, again, migrant workers working in situations where they're not necessarily afforded the same protection. So maybe they don't have the same, they don't have a mask to do their work safely or the proper safety wear that they would be required for that work. So they're working long hours in unsafe conditions, and then they may be having most of their pay withheld by the employer. They're facing threats of deportation or experiencing abuse in the workplace as a means to control them.
And that would be very hard for the person themselves to identify that this is not okay. And then especially if it's somebody coming into Canada, wouldn't know what resources to reach out to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a number of elements here. So there's obviously a cultural barrier for migrant workers. There's a language barrier. We found through some of our research that a lot of migrant workers are actually not well informed of what their workplace rights are here in Canada. And then I always think that the element of potential blacklisting by the employer, fear of deportation keeps people quiet, right? And we know that sometimes migrant workers will earn a little bit of money. They're able to keep a little bit of money. And in many cases, they have a large debt that they need to repay. So they've taken out a large loan to come to Canada for a work opportunity or a schooling opportunity. And so they may continue to choose to stay in that situation because they lack other choices and they have to repay that debt.
So let's talk about sex trafficking now. And there's, I think, a bit of a broad definition when it comes to that, because there's age groups, there's socioeconomic status. So I guess if we can, I don't know, is there a definition that you have that can kind of cover what people could consider as sex trafficking?
Yeah, similar to the definition that I shared at the beginning, it's using those elements of force. So physically forcing someone, you're tricking someone into a situation, or coercion. So you're saying, if you don't do this, I will do this, into the commercial sex industry against their will. So that person has a little choice over who they see, what they do. The trafficker is taking their money. The trafficker is controlling their movements. It's controlling every aspect of their life. But typically with sex trafficking, where we see that initial relationship between the trafficker and the trafficking victim, I use victim, survivor. Typically what we're seeing in Canada is a lot of like the Romeo trafficker or the boyfriend trafficker. So on the outside, to a member of the public, it may look like an intimate partner relationship. To a law enforcement officer who might be called to a situation, it might look like intimate partner violence. But when you start to kind of tease things apart and start to ask questions, there's actually more going on. And so it can present as a relationship. And traffickers can be someone's intimate partner, it can be a friend, it can be a parent, it can be an acquaintance, it can be someone's employer.
Yeah, you mentioned Romeo trafficker. So I think that there, when I was on your website, there was a Romeo trafficker, and that there was one that was more of a violence-based trafficker. And the Romeo trafficker goes across age groups, and I think that that's one of the things that's so shocking. And we look at child abuse and child trafficking, and you often think of that as high school students. Sure. So if we can first talk about the high school students, and then we can talk about the very distressing numbers of younger kids.
Sure. So I think traffickers are really adept at identifying what's missing in someone's life. So they really kind of go through this courtship phase where they're asking a lot of questions to identify what that person's intrinsic, vulnerability is. Is it problems at home? Is it socioeconomic? Is it mental illness? Is there potential drug abuse happening that they can kind of supplement? So once they've identified what the need is, the trafficker becomes the solution, right? So they become that person's partner, their protector, their provider, whatever it is. And that's how they kind of ingratiate themselves into the individual's life. All the while, they're going to start doing elements of isolation. So they're going to start to pull that person away from their community of supports, their family and friends. There may be a bit of kind of that honeymoon phase, and then maybe a bit of, inter-relationship conflict, kind of the back and forth, the hot and cold. If the individual has drug dependency, they may use that as a bargaining chip. They may withhold that. So really, they're trying to identify kind of that weakness or that issue in that person's life, identify themselves as the solution, and then really use that as a leverage to convince them to participate in the commercial sex industry. Oftentimes, we see individuals willingly, consent to engage in commercial sex. But once they start to kind of go into that first, second, third act, they're unable to revoke their consent, and they're being trafficked. So in Canada, we do see a lot of that grooming, luring is happening online particularly. And I think social media has made it really efficient for traffickers to reach out to youth, right? To identify those red flags on someone's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. They can message dozens of young people and sort of sit back and wait to see who is going to respond to that kind of question or compliment. It is often starting as a compliment, right? They're kind of doing, it's a bit of like a fishing exercise, right? They're looking to see who's going to respond, who is suggestive to that kind of flattery. So yeah, it typically with young people, we are seeing that Romeo trafficker, boyfriend type of trafficker happening. It starts in high school, but the grooming and luring for certainly is happening quite a bit younger.
And because they prey on the vulnerable, as I think sometimes it's hard to understand, especially with with anybody, but with a younger person, how do they end up in a hotel room in downtown Toronto being sold, and I think that's the other part, is when you're talking about commercial, it's not the person being trafficked who is getting the money. The
Absolutely not.
commercialization is the person who's
Yes.
the lurer. But it's hard to understand sometimes. Well, why don't you just walk away? What is it
Sure,
that,
sure.
yes, I can see you maybe, initially, hey, this older guy is interested in me. This is really cool. Why don't you walk away and stop when you realize what's happening to you?
Yeah, I think that's a question that folks who are unfamiliar with the issue ask quite a bit is, why can't they leave? And um, trafficking survivors often have the illusion of freedom of movement. And so the holds that traffickers have on their victims is often largely psychological. So social media, movies are going to tell us that people are captured in white vans and they're held. And while that certainly can happen, largely what we see is that it's a psychological bond between the trafficker and the victim. And many victims will say to us that they didn't actually know what was happening to them while they were being trafficked is a crime. If you don't know that it's a crime, then you're certainly not necessarily going to reach out for help. And I know, Janice, one of the things that you like to talk about is like stigma around mental health and certain social issues. There is so much stigma around the commercial sex industry, whether you're there by choice or by circumstance or coercion. And I think so many times trafficking survivors are afraid to reach out for help, right? For fear of stigma from law enforcement, not sure what their families are going to think, how their peers and society is going to accept them after all of that they've been through. So I think shame and stigma are one of the number one reasons that survivors who have left, gotten out on their own, stay quiet. But it's really one of the reasons why folks who are being currently trafficked don't reach out for help.
Yeah, that makes sense, because we know that people who are physically abused can often make it's them. They deserved it.
Sure.
They did something
Sure,
wrong.
sure. Or I consented to this, or, I agreed to do this. And there's a lot of blaming of themselves and guilt and shame around the trafficking experience.
Now, I believe it's 80 or 90% of actually, before I go to that, I want to talk about how that kind of psychological hold on someone can have that person, their trafficker, the person perpetuating this horrible situation, will then say, do you know someone younger? It's kind of, I think you refer to it as babysitting. Oh, do you have a friend who's younger, maybe 12, who might be interested in having me babysit them? And then it sort of perpetuates down to that totally disgusting level of, into kids who are younger than 10 and sometimes even younger than 5 years old.
I mean, I don't know about babysitting as a recruitment tactic, but I think what we see with trafficking is it is a low risk, high reward crime, right? There are very low prosecution rates in this country. Traffickers, police are doing better, but by and large, traffickers are going undetected. And so if they are having success trafficking one young person, I think there are a lot of folks out there who are trafficking and who can see that the potential benefit of having multiple victims, right? I think, if we see situations of trafficking on OnlyFans, right, using those digital platforms where it's almost like a way to control folks and have an income and control multiple individuals. So we have seen scenarios where trafficking victims, and criminal courts use the word victim, trafficking victims will be forced to recruit others on behalf of the trafficker. And, that's a really tricky situation because they themselves are victims. And it's a survival tactic, right? They are trying to survive. So yes, it certainly does happen.
Around, I believe it's 80 or 90% of people being trafficked are women or girls, but the other 10% are boys, or I don't know whether it goes into the above 18 age where it may be less likely that a man would the man is more likely to become the trafficker as opposed to being trafficked. But How is this manifested with boys?
It's a great question. I think overwhelmingly social service providers are seeing, and I would say not to the same degree that they're seeing women and girls being victims of trafficking, but certainly men and boys can be victims of trafficking, and labor trafficking. I would say labor trafficking tends to skew more to the male side simply because it's often
Okay.
physical labor that we're bringing in under the temporary foreign worker program. But our data also suggests that transgender individuals and gender diverse individuals are being exploited at far higher rates than their overall population size. So again, if you think about a young person, a young LGBTQ2 plus person, a young trans person, that right there, your identity there as a member of that community is already something that is a risk factor, right? We know that a lot of LGBTQ youth are often, kicked out of their homes when they come out, or if they're transitioning. And so that puts a young person in a really precarious position. They may need to couch surf or live with friends or go into the shelter system. Shelter system is one of the #1 places where recruitment is happening by sex traffickers, right? So they're noticing that vulnerability. It's an underhoused youth. They are identifying as from a marginalized population. You've got a number of risk factors right there.
Yeah, that makes sense. The allure of going to a safe place where you're have a bed to sleep in and food
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of thing. The majority, and this is not surprising, the majority of people being trafficked are Indigenous, and I think that I don't even know how to put this. How do you explain why Indigenous people are more vulnerable? And it goes to the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls.
Yeah, I think I like to frame the conversation around trafficking as thinking about what are the root causes, right? So instead of talking about what someone has that makes them vulnerable, what are the conditions in society that have set someone up to become that vulnerable potential victim, right? So if we're thinking about Indigenous women and girls in this country, we're thinking about the legacy of colonialism, thinking about systemic racism. We're thinking about the lack of economic opportunity that they're afforded. We're thinking about the fact that folks are living in rural and remote communities and often having to leave those communities for high school, for medical appointments, for learning opportunities. And then they become disassociated from their community of supports. Those are all the things that make folks really at risk for being targeted once they're in a new city without that community. I think, we think about all the isms that exist in Canada. Those are the things that make someone at risk for being targeted by a trafficker. Really putting the onus on the institutions, the environment, and the perpetrator, right? And less about the focus on what was inside the victim or happening to the victim. Is what are all of these social conditions that kind of transpired at the same time to create this environment.
I went to Stats Canada, and I read that in 2023, there were 570, I believe, incidents of human trafficking identified. And you have the Center to End Human Trafficking Hotline.
Mm-hmm.
And that is I think it started, I don't know how many years ago, but you've been collecting
2019.
statistics.
Yeah. So
so your number of people is very high. I think I read around 460, not as high as law enforcement is dealing with, but the number of people who would A, be aware of the hotline, but B, call.
Yeah. So the hotline launched in 2019. It's a national trauma-informed confidential service. We're operating 24/7, 365, French and English. We get calls from communities, right? It's not just victims and survivors calling the hotline. The largest caller type to the hotline are family and friends of someone who is potentially being exploited, and really recognizing that this is a community issue. So Well, absolutely. Victims and survivors are calling us. They are looking for resources and services. They're looking to exit their trafficking situation. Sometimes they're looking for a connection to law enforcement. They want to report their trafficking situation, or they need a police escort to get out of their trafficking situation. More so, folks are looking for information and resources. So they're really looking, survivors are really looking for those critical services. They're going to help stabilize themselves. And family members are looking for information. They're really looking to understand what the risk factors or whatever they're seeing in that person that they love. They're looking to kind of substantiate that. But what are the next steps? What should I do as someone who cares about someone who's at risk? What are the resources available to me? How do I have that conversation? How do I open the door for that conversation in a safe way that feels good for me, that feels affirming for that person? So we really think that the hotline is for everybody, and we really encourage anyone with questions or looking for resources about the issue to call us. The number is 1-833-900-1010.
And I fumbled the website, so I will give the website again, which is Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline.ca. Ashley, thanks for coming on and talking. We could talk forever about this situation. It's such a dire and growing issue in Canada. And as you said, I work in the internet world, and I see the kids that are on there and the things that everybody can see. I mean, you can see anything you want. And quite easily. So thank you for the work you do and for the work that the center does.
And thank you for continuing to spotlight this really important issue and having these conversations. It does matter. And I hope that we reach the folks who need to see this.